Daniel had never thought much about hiring a live-in maid before. Life had been moving fast, and the idea of having someone help with daily chores seemed like a small luxury he could finally afford. He had always been independent, handling his own meals, laundry, and cleaning. But with a demanding job that required long hours and frequent travel, he realized he needed help to keep his apartment in order. He wasn't sure what to expect from the process, but he wanted someone professional, responsible, and discreet. When he first met Lena, she arrived at the door with a small suitcase. Carrying herself with a calm, measured confidence, her uniform was crisp, neat, and almost spotless, as if it had been ironed with care just that morning. She greeted him politely, using formal words and a soft, clear voice that was easy to understand. Daniel noticed her posture straight, but not stiffened the way she carried herself. Made it clear that she was used to following rules and paying attention to details. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing to suggest she was trying to impress anyone. But she had an aura of quiet professionalism that immediately put Daniel at ease, as she unpacked her belongings. Lena made a casual remark about her uniform. "It is made for human men," she said, almost as if she were thinking out loud. Without any intention of making Daniel feel awkward, Daniel blinked at her, unsure if he had heard her correctly. He laughed lightly, assuming that it was a joke or maybe a quirk of her accent. "Made for human men," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. Lena nodded, tilting her head slightly as if confirming a fact everyone should already know. Daniel chuckled, shrugging. It didn't sound serious, and in his mind, it was probably just a funny way to say the uniform was designed for work around a home where men lived. He didn't think much more about it at that moment. Over the next few days, Daniel began noticing small details he had never considered before. Lena moved efficiently through the apartment, tidying, cleaning, and organizing. She always knew what to do next and anticipated tasks before Daniel even asked. Her work ethic was remarkable, and it was clear she took pride in her job. But there was something else, something subtle, yet hard to ignore. Whenever guests came over, especially men, Lena's demeanor seemed to shift slightly. She remained polite, but there was a noticeable difference in how people interacted with her compared to Daniel. Some spoke louder as if trying to assert their presence. Others leaned in closer, smiling in a way that seemed too familiar for a professional setting. Daniel began to see a pattern, though he couldn't yet put it into words. One afternoon, a neighbor dropped by to borrow a cup of sugar. Lena answered the door in her uniform, greeting the neighbor with a warm, professional smile. Daniel followed behind her, carrying a small basket of laundry. As the neighbor chatted, Daniel noticed that he had unconsciously moved closer to Lena, speaking louder than necessary and gesturing in a way that made her pause for a brief moment. Daniel felt a wave of unease. He knew Lena was competent and capable, yet the neighbor's behavior seemed influenced by the uniform she was wearing rather than the person she actually was. Daniel realized, with a mix of embarrassment and concern, that he had underestimated the effect of appearances and how society often judged people before truly seeing them. That evening, Daniel asked Lena to help with some ironing. As she worked, he decided to bring up her earlier comment about the uniform. "You said your uniform is made for human men," he said casually, trying to keep the tone light. Lena glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued ironing, her hands moving smoothly over the fabric. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but measured. "It is true. In my country, uniforms like this are not just for work. They are designed in a way that makes people behave differently around those who wear them." Daniel paused, unsure what she meant. Lena looked at him, her eyes steady and serious. "Some people see it as a sign of obedience, or even availability. It is not about respect or skill. It is about perception." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had never considered that clothing alone could carry such a weight of expectation. He had always thought of uniforms as neutral, just work clothes to identify roles. Yet here was Lena, explaining in simple, clear terms that what seemed ordinary could actually shape how others treated her. He began to notice the small signs he had missed. The way delivery men sometimes spoke to her differently. The subtle changes in tone when guests gave instructions. The way some visitors seemed more comfortable issuing orders than engaging in polite conversation. All of these moments, once invisible to him, now felt obvious and troubling. Over the next week, Daniel started observing more carefully. He noticed that Lena's body language shifted subtly depending on her clothes. When she wore her uniform, she moved cautiously, always aware of how others might react. She smiled politely, answered questions directly. But there was a restraint in her movements, a carefulness that suggested she was always calculating how much to reveal of herself. On her days off, when she wore casual, modest clothing, Lena seemed lighter, freer. She laughed more openly, walked with ease, and interacted with people without the same level of caution. The contrast was striking. Daniel realized that the uniform was more than just clothing. It was a lens through which others viewed her, often in ways that undermined her dignity. One morning, as Daniel prepared for work, he found himself thinking about Lena and the uniform. He watched her as she moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast and organizing supplies. He noticed the way she paused briefly whenever a delivery man rang the doorbell, the subtle way she adjusted her posture when a visitor arrived. For the first time, he understood that her comment on the first day had been more than a quirky observation. It was a warning, a truth about the world she navigated daily. Daniel felt a mix of guilt and responsibility. He had laughed it off initially, but now he could see that what Lena had said carried a deeper meaning, one that spoke to issues of respect, perception, and the silent power of appearance. By the end of that week, Daniel had begun a quiet journey of awareness. He started paying more attention to the little details, the way people behaved around Lena, the subtle shifts in tone and body language, the unspoken expectations imposed by clothing. He realized that society often judged people before knowing them, and uniforms could amplify those judgments in ways he had never considered. Lena, in her calm, professional way, had opened his eyes to a reality he had ignored, that appearances could shape experience. And that respect was not automatic, but earned and acknowledged. Daniel never forgot the words Lena had spoken that first day. "It is made for human men." At the time, he had laughed. Now, he understood their weight. They were not a joke, not an idle comment. They were a statement of reality, a lesson in observation and empathy, and an introduction to a part of life Daniel had never seen before. From that moment on, he resolved to pay closer attention, to understand more deeply, and to ensure that Lena and everyone around him was treated with the dignity they deserved, regardless of what they wore. By the time Daniel left for work on the following Monday, he watched Lena carefully fold the last of the laundry, her uniform neat and precise. He felt a newfound respect for her, not just for the work she did, but for the composure she maintained in the face of invisible pressures. He realized that the uniform was not a symbol of who she was, but of how the world tried to define her. And he knew that from now on he would see Lena for herself, not the uniform she wore, and that he had a lot to learn about the quiet lessons hidden in everyday life. Over the next few weeks, Daniel started noticing small changes around the apartment, changes he hadn't expected. At first, they seemed almost insignificant, little details he might have ignored if he hadn't been paying closer attention. But slowly he began to realize that the way Lena was treated by visitors, delivery personnel, and even casual acquaintances depended a lot on the uniform she wore. It was subtle, sometimes almost invisible, yet undeniable once you started noticing it. One afternoon, a courier arrived to deliver a large package. Daniel was in the middle of a conference call, so he asked Lena to handle the delivery. She greeted the man politely, signed the receipt, and thanked him. Daniel, still on the call, glanced out of the corner of his eye and noticed something strange. The courier, a man in his late 20s, was speaking in a slightly louder voice than necessary. His gestures seemed exaggerated, as if he were unconsciously trying to dominate the interaction. Lena, however, maintained her composure, her voice calm and measured. But there was a hint of tension in her shoulders, a slight stiffness in the way she moved. Daniel's curiosity was piqued. He had seen people behave differently toward service workers before, but this felt different. It wasn't rudeness or impatience. It was as if the courier assumed something about Lena based solely on her uniform. He didn't really see her as a competent adult managing the delivery. Instead, he saw her as someone who existed in a world defined by the clothes she wore. Daniel felt a wave of discomfort. He knew Lena was professional, and yet society seemed to impose invisible expectations on her the moment she put on that uniform. That evening, Daniel asked Lena casually if she had noticed the courier's behavior. She paused, folding the last of the laundry neatly before replying. "Yes," she said quietly, almost as if confirming something she had known all along. "It happens often. People see the uniform and immediately assume certain things. They think they can speak louder, be more direct, or even make jokes they would never make to someone outside the uniform." Daniel frowned. It was difficult for him to imagine that a simple outfit could influence people's behavior so strongly. He had always thought that manners and respect were universal, something you offered to everyone equally. Clearly, he had been mistaken. Over the next few days, Daniel began observing more closely. He noticed that guests, especially men, treated Lena differently depending on what she wore. When she was in uniform, they often assumed a familiarity that didn't exist, leaning in slightly, joking in ways that would have felt inappropriate with someone else, or speaking as if she existed only to follow their instructions. When she wore casual clothes, however, their tone changed immediately. There was a polite distance, a recognition that she was a full person with her own thoughts and dignity. The contrast was striking, and it made Daniel uncomfortable. He realized that for Lena, the uniform was more than clothing. It was a barrier between her and the respect she deserved. One evening, Daniel hosted a small dinner for a few colleagues. Lena served the meal efficiently, moving around the room with quiet confidence. Daniel noticed that some of his colleagues unconsciously paid more attention to her than to the details of the dinner itself. They asked her questions that had nothing to do with the food, smiled a little too brightly, and leaned closer than necessary. Daniel could see the slight tension in Lena's posture, careful way she responded without giving anyone a reason to feel entitled to more of her attention. He felt a pang of guilt. He had laughed at her comment about the uniform when she first said it, but now he understood its true meaning. That night after the guests left, Daniel found himself sitting with Lena in the kitchen. He wanted to understand more, to make sense of what he was seeing. "Lena," he began hesitantly, "I've noticed how differently people treat you depending on what you wear. It's unsettling. Do you deal with this often?" Lena nodded. She set down the dishes she had been drying and leaned against the counter. "Yes," she said softly. "It is part of the job, but it is also part of life. People see the uniform and forget that there is a person behind it. They see it as a symbol, not as clothing. They don't think about respect, only about how they think they can behave." Daniel listened carefully. He could see the strain in her face, a quiet exhaustion from constantly being aware of how people might treat her. He realized that her calm demeanor was not just professionalism. It was a shield. The uniform, which seemed simple on the surface, carried a weight she had to manage every day. He thought about the delivery men, the neighbors, the colleagues at the dinner, how they had unconsciously assumed something about her simply because of what she wore. And he understood, painfully, how easy it would be for anyone in her position to feel diminished. Even if no one intended harm, the next few days brought even more insight. Daniel started noticing things he had previously overlooked. The way Lena adjusted her posture when certain visitors arrived. The subtle changes in her tone when answering questions. The careful way she moved around the apartment when outsiders were present. Every small movement seemed deliberate, a quiet strategy to protect herself from assumptions and misunderstandings. He realized that what he had once thought of as ordinary behavior was actually a form of survival, a way to navigate a world that often judged her by appearance rather than character. One afternoon, Daniel decided to watch more closely, not to intrude but to understand. He observed as Lena interacted with the delivery driver. She smiled politely, answered questions clearly, and completed the task efficiently. Yet he could see a subtle tension in her shoulders, a carefulness in her gestures. She did not relax completely until the man had left. Daniel felt a deep sense of respect for her. She was managing something he had never truly considered before. balancing professionalism with the awareness of how society treated her. Later that evening, Daniel and Lena had a quiet conversation about her experience. "It's not just the uniform," she explained. "It is the way people expect things from you when you wear it. They think you exist to serve, to be polite, to follow rules without question. They forget that you have thoughts, feelings, and choices of your own. The uniform makes them assume things that are not true about you." Daniel nodded, absorbing her words. He realized that the problem was not with Lena or her behavior. It was with the assumptions of society, the invisible pressures imposed by appearances. In the ways people judged others without really seeing them, Daniel's awareness grew with each passing day. He began to see the small, often unnoticed ways society treated women in service roles, and how clothing could amplify or shape those interactions. He felt a responsibility not to change the world overnight, but to ensure that Lena felt respected and valued in his home. He began to adjust his own behavior, paying closer attention to how he introduced her to others, how he spoke in her presence, and how he responded to situations where her dignity might be at risk. By the end of the week, Daniel realized that what had seemed like a simple remark from Lena on her first day was actually a profound insight. Made for human men, those words were not just a joke or a casual comment. They were a statement about perception, power, and respect. They were a reminder that appearances matter, but character and dignity matter more. Daniel felt grateful that Lena had trusted him enough to reveal the truth, even indirectly. And he knew that he would never see a uniform more the person wearing it. The same way again, Daniel also began to reflect on his own assumptions. How often had he judged people without thinking? How many times had he assumed competence, personality, or worth based on superficial signs? Lena's calm explanation had opened his eyes to a world he had ignored. A world where small details carried large consequences. He realized that understanding, empathy, and careful observation were essential not just for Lena, but for everyone he interacted with. The apartment felt different now, in a subtle but important way. Daniel noticed his own behavior changing. He treated Lena with even more respect, asked her opinions on decisions around the house, and ensured that visitors were always polite and considerate. Lena, in turn, moved with a quiet ease that Daniel had not seen before. The subtle tension that had accompanied her movements began to ease, replaced by a sense of comfort and recognition. The balance was delicate, but it was improving, thanks to awareness and care. For Daniel, those few weeks were transformative. He had gone from seeing Lena as simply a helper to understanding her as a person navigating a complex social reality. He had learned to recognize subtle cues, to observe carefully, and to think critically about assumptions society often makes. Most importantly, he had begun to understand the meaning behind her first words. "It is made for human men." They were not just about a uniform, they were about respect, dignity, and seeing people for who they truly are. It was a quiet evening when Daniel finally had a chance to sit down with Lena and talk more deeply about what she had meant when she said her uniform was made for human men. He had been observing her for weeks, now and noticed how differently people treated her depending on what she wore. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that her casual remark on the first day wasn't just a strange comment, it was a glimpse into a world he had never really understood. Daniel poured himself a cup of tea and offered one to Lena. She accepted politely. Sitting across from him at the small kitchen table, the apartment was peaceful. The usual noise of delivery trucks and passing traffic was faint. Creating the perfect environment for a serious conversation, Daniel took a deep breath. "Lena," he began carefully, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about your uniform. I don't fully understand it yet. Could you explain?" Lena set down her cup and leaned back slightly, gathering her thoughts. Her eyes, calm and clear, looked directly at Daniel. "It is not easy to explain," she said softly. "People outside my country might not understand, because they have different ways of seeing things. But in my home country, uniforms like this are not just clothing. They are designed to send messages." She paused for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. They tell people how to behave, even if they do not realize it. They tell them that the person wearing the uniform is obedient, polite, and available to follow orders. People do not see the person. They see only what the uniform represents. Daniel listened intently. The explanation was more serious than he had expected. He had thought the uniform was just a practical outfit, something that identified Lena as a professional. But now he understood it could also shape the way people thought about her, even unconsciously. So, he said slowly, "You're saying that the uniform changes the way people treat you?" Lena nodded. "Yes," she said simply. "Even if I am the same person I was before putting it on, people see only the uniform. They make assumptions that are not true. They speak louder, lean closer, or act as if they can give orders that I must follow. It is subtle, but it happens every day." Daniel felt a mix of surprise and sadness. He had never thought about how clothing could influence respect and perception. He began remembering the small things he had noticed over the past weeks, the way the delivery men spoke to her, the subtle changes in tone from visitors, the careful way she moved around the apartment. Now, it made sense. The uniform wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol that affected her life in ways he had never realized. Lena continued, speaking quietly but with a strength in her voice. "I learned early that the world judges by appearances. My family taught me to be careful, to always be aware of how people might treat me because of the way I look or what I wear. The uniform makes this even stronger. People see it and assume things about me without knowing who I am. Sometimes it is small things, a louder voice, a joke, a smile that is too familiar, but over time, it builds up. It is exhausting." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had never considered how much invisible pressure someone could feel every single day just because of the clothes they wore. He thought about Lena's composure, how she had always remained polite, calm, and efficient, even when people assumed things about her. It wasn't just professionalism. It was strength and resilience. He realized how much courage it must take to keep smiling, to keep working, and to keep living with that constant awareness. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I think I understand now," he said softly. "It's not that you are weak or submissive. It's that the uniform sends a message that people act upon, and you have to navigate it carefully. You have to protect yourself without causing offense, without making people uncomfortable." "That must be so tiring," Lena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It is tiring," she admitted, "but it is also something I have learned to manage. I know that the way I behave, the way I carry myself, can influence how people treat me. I cannot control their thoughts, but I can control how I respond. That is why I always pay attention to details, to body language, to tone of voice. I have to be careful." Daniel thought about this for a long moment. He realized that he had been unaware of how powerful first impressions could be, how much weight clothing could carry, and how society often judged people before getting to know them. He had assumed that manners were universal, that respect was automatic. But Lena's explanation showed him how wrong he had been. Respect was not guaranteed. It was something people had to earn, recognize, and acknowledge, especially when appearances created false assumptions. As they talked, Daniel began to ask more questions. "Did people treat you differently in other countries?" he asked. Lena shook her head. "Sometimes. It depends on the culture, the history, the rules that society follows. But in my country, it is especially strong. People have been taught for generations to see uniforms as symbols, not as clothing. They do not stop to think about the person inside. That is why I said on the first day, the uniform is made for human men. It is designed to influence behavior, to create assumptions. That is what I meant." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He thought back to all the small interactions he had witnessed: the neighbor who leaned too close, the courier who spoke too loudly, the colleagues who smiled a little too brightly. Each interaction, once unnoticed, now made sense. Lena had been navigating these moments carefully, maintaining her dignity while managing the assumptions of others. He felt admiration and a deep sense of responsibility. He realized that it was not enough to hire her for work. He had to ensure she was respected, valued, and treated fairly in his home. Over the next few days, Daniel observed Lena more closely, but this time with a new understanding. He noticed how she moved around the apartment with precision and care, how she positioned herself in conversations, and how she adjusted her tone to maintain professionalism. These were not just habits, they were strategies learned from experience, ways to navigate a world that often judged by appearances. He began to see her not only as a competent worker, but as someone with strength, intelligence, and resilience that went far beyond the tasks she performed. One evening, Daniel decided to make a small change. He asked Lena if she would like to wear a slightly different outfit for her daily work, something comfortable, modest, and professional, but not the traditional uniform. Lena looked at him, surprised but pleased. "That would be good," she said. "It will change how people see me. It will give me more freedom." Daniel realized that even small changes could make a significant difference in her life. Clothing, he now understood, was not just about appearance, it was about perception, respect, and dignity. As Lena began wearing her new outfit, Daniel observed the change immediately. Delivery men spoke to her differently, visitors treated her with more politeness, and there was a noticeable ease in her movements. The subtle tension he had seen before began to fade. Lena smiled more freely, laughed more openly, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that filled the apartment with a new energy. Daniel felt a sense of relief, knowing that she no longer had to navigate the same invisible pressures she had before. Daniel also reflected on his own behavior during this time. He realized that he had to be conscious of how he introduced Lena to others, how he responded to assumptions, and how he could help create an environment of respect. He learned that awareness and small actions could have a big impact, not just for Lena, but for anyone in a similar position. It was a lesson in empathy, observation, and the quiet power of everyday decisions. By the end of that week, Daniel understood fully why Lena had made her first remark about the uniform. It was not a joke, not a casual observation. It was a truth, a lesson, and a warning, wrapped in a simple sentence. Made for human men, those words carried meaning far beyond what he had initially imagined. They spoke of perception, control, and the silent power of appearance. They reminded him that dignity and respect were not automatic. They had to be recognized, supported, and protected. Daniel looked at Lena with a new sense of understanding. He realized that she had been teaching him from day one, giving him insight into a world he had never noticed before. It was a lesson in observation, empathy, and respect, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The uniform, once a simple piece of clothing, had become a symbol of awareness, a reminder that appearances could influence behavior, but that kindness, dignity, and understanding could counteract those assumptions. In the quiet of that evening, Daniel felt grateful for Lena's presence, her trust, and her honesty. He understood that the small changes he had made were not just about comfort, they were about acknowledging her worth, seeing her as a person rather than a symbol, and respecting the individuality she brought to his home. And in that moment, he realized that true understanding often came from listening, observing, and caring deeply about the people around us, beyond what appearances might suggest. Over the next few weeks, Daniel noticed subtle changes in the apartment that made a big difference in Lena's confidence and comfort. The small adjustment of allowing her to wear her own professional, modest clothing instead of the traditional uniform had already begun to shift the way people behaved around her. It was a quiet transformation, almost invisible at first, but it was powerful. Daniel realized that the choices he made could influence not only Lena's comfort, but also how society's assumptions affected her daily life. It began with small interactions. The delivery men no longer spoke too loudly or leaned too close. They were polite, professional, and treated Lena as they would any adult managing a task efficiently. Neighbors who dropped by casually no longer assumed familiarity. They treated her with courtesy and respect. Daniel observed these interactions carefully, feeling a growing sense of relief. He had underestimated the importance of appearances and the subtle pressures they placed on Lena. Now he understood that clothing could alter perception. And by giving her more choice, he was helping to restore her dignity. Lena herself began to show changes that Daniel could not miss. She moved around the apartment with an ease that had not been there before. Her smile came more naturally, her laughter rang out without hesitation, and her posture suggested a quiet pride rather than careful calculation. It was clear that the small act of giving her choice had relieved a tension she had carried for a long time. Daniel realized that empowerment often comes in small, thoughtful gestures. The change in her demeanor was immediate proof that respect and autonomy mattered as much as work and skill. One afternoon, Daniel decided to observe how Lena interacted with visitors in her new outfit. A neighbor had come to borrow some kitchen supplies.
Oh.
Lena greeted him warmly, her voice confident, her movements smooth and relaxed. The neighbor responded, politely maintaining a respectful distance, and even apologized when he realized he had interrupted her work. Daniel noticed how effortless the interaction had become. The tension that once existed when she wore the uniform had vanished. It was a subtle change, but the effect on her comfort and confidence was profound. Later that day, Daniel and Lena had a quiet conversation about the changes she had noticed. "It is much easier now," Lena said, her voice calm and steady. "People see me as a person first, not as a symbol. They interact with me with respect because there is no expectation tied to the clothes I wear. I can focus on my work without worrying about how they perceive me. It is a relief." Daniel nodded, realizing how heavy the invisible burden must have been before. He could now see the full impact of what he had done. A simple choice allowing her to pick her work attire had improved her life in a tangible, meaningful way. As the days went by, Daniel also began to reflect on his own actions and assumptions. He realized that he had to be more aware of how he introduced Lena to others and how he responded to situations where her dignity might be at risk. For example, when guests arrived, he would make sure to speak to them in a way that acknowledged Lena's professionalism. He would subtly guide conversations to avoid unnecessary assumptions or jokes that might make her uncomfortable. It was a new form of attentiveness, quiet effort to create an environment where respect was automatic rather than assumed. One morning, Daniel was in the living room when a courier arrived with a large package. Lena greeted him calmly as usual and completed the task efficiently. Daniel observed from a distance and noticed the difference immediately. The courier spoke clearly, politely, and kept a professional distance. There was no assumption of familiarity, no unconscious shift in tone or behavior. Lena finished the interaction and returned to the kitchen, smiling lightly. Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction. It was a small victory, but it symbolized the importance of giving people respect and allowing them the freedom to control how they are perceived. The changes in Lena's confidence also began to affect other aspects of life in the apartment. She organized tasks more efficiently, completed chores with a lighter demeanor, and even offered suggestions for improving household routines, something she had rarely done before. Daniel noticed that her voice carried more authority, not because she demanded it, but because she felt respected and valued. The dynamic in the apartment had shifted subtly, but significantly. Respect, he realized, was not just about politeness. Created a space where people could contribute fully and confidently. Daniel also reflected on the lessons he was learning from Lena's experience. He began to notice how often society places invisible pressures on people based on appearance, clothing, or assumed roles. He thought about the subtle judgments that occur every day, how people unconsciously respond to symbols rather than individuals. And he understood that even small actions, like offering choice, speaking politely, or acknowledging someone's expertise, could make a meaningful difference. It was a reminder that dignity is fragile, but respect and awareness can strengthen it. One evening, Daniel decided to take a walk with Lena through the nearby park. It was a casual outing, something they rarely did together, but he wanted to understand her perspective outside the apartment. As they walked, Lena talked about her experiences in her home country, the expectations placed on her as a woman in service roles, and the ways she had learned to navigate them. Daniel listened carefully, absorbing every word. He realized that her calm demeanor and professionalism were not innate. They were developed skills, shaped by experience and necessity. The uniform, he now understood, had been both a tool and a challenge, a tool for work, but a challenge for dignity. During their walk, they observed people interacting around them. Parents called the children, friends chatted on benches, and joggers passed by. Daniel noticed how Lena paid attention to body language, tone of voice, and gestures, she explained. Quietly, that these small signals often indicated how people would behave in different situations. Daniel realized that the awareness Lena carried at all times was a skill, a form of emotional intelligence that allowed her to navigate complex social environments with grace and calm. It was both impressive and humbling. Back at the apartment, Daniel reflected on the growth he had witnessed in Lena since allowing her to choose her clothing. The subtle acts of respect and recognition had transformed the way she moved, worked, and interacted. He realized that creating an environment of dignity was not about grand gestures, but about consistent, thoughtful actions. Listening, observing, offering choice, and acknowledging someone's expertise were powerful tools for fostering confidence and autonomy. Over time, Daniel also noticed changes in his own thinking. He became more aware of assumptions he made about people, more attentive to how appearances could influence behavior, and more thoughtful about how he treated those around him. Presence had taught him that respect and dignity are not automatic. They are cultivated through awareness, observation, and small, consistent actions. He began applying this understanding not only at home, but in his work, with friends, and in everyday interactions. By the end of the week, Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Lena's quiet transformation had reinforced an important lesson. Respect and dignity matter, and even small changes can make a profound difference in someone's life. The uniform, once a source of invisible pressure, had been replaced by choice, autonomy, and comfort. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It had become a space of understanding, awareness, and respect. Daniel looked at Lena one evening. As she moved through the apartment, preparing dinner, she smiled lightly, her movements relaxed and confident. He realized that the lessons he had learned went far beyond clothing or work. They were about seeing people for who they truly are, acknowledging their worth, and creating environments where dignity and respect are automatic, not assumed. It was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. In those quiet moments, Daniel understood fully why Lena had spoken the words on her first day. It is made for human men. They were not just about a uniform, they were about perception, respect, and understanding. They were a reminder that dignity could be influenced by small, everyday choices, and that awareness and care could make life easier, fairer, and more meaningful for everyone. He was grateful for the insight she had shared, for the trust she had placed in him, and for the quiet lessons that had changed the way he viewed the world. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel realized that his home had changed in more ways than he could have imagined. It was no longer just a place where he lived and Lena worked. It had become a space of mutual understanding, respect, and quiet growth. The changes in Lena were evident to anyone who visited. What was more remarkable was how the entire dynamic of the apartment had shifted. The atmosphere was lighter, more harmonious, filled with a sense of dignity that had been missing before. Lena herself had grown noticeably more confident. She moved through the apartment with a sense of calm assurance. Her posture relaxed, her voice steady, and her expressions open and genuine. Daniel noticed that she smiled more often, laughed more freely, and even offered suggestions about household organization and routines, something she had rarely done before. It was clear that the freedom to choose her clothing, combined with the respect Daniel consistently showed her, had given her a new sense of autonomy and pride. One morning, Daniel prepared breakfast and invited Lena to sit down with him. He wanted to take a moment to reflect on how far things had come. "I've been thinking," he said softly, "about the first day you arrived and said your uniform was made for human men. I understand now what you meant, and I realize how much I have learned from you since then." Lena smiled politely, her eyes calm and thoughtful. "It was not easy for me to explain at first," she admitted. "Many people would not understand, but I am glad you listened and noticed. That is why things feel different now." Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. "It is more than just the uniform, isn't it? It is about respect, dignity, and seeing people for who they really are. I've realized how much small actions matter, the way we speak, how we introduce people, the freedom we give them to be themselves." Lena nodded again, her expression serious. "Exactly," she said. It is not about making changes for yourself, but about giving people the chance to exist fully without assumptions controlling their every move. That is what makes a real difference. Over time, Daniel began to notice how these lessons extended beyond his apartment. He became more aware of the invisible pressures that people face in everyday life, the assumptions made about women, service workers, and even people he interacted with at work. He began to listen more carefully, observe more attentively, and treat everyone with the respect they deserved, regardless of their role or appearance. Lena's quiet guidance had reshaped not only his home, but also his perspective on life. One afternoon, Daniel invited a friend over who was unaware of the recent changes. Lena greeted him warmly, her confidence clear, and handled the visit with ease. Daniel watched closely as the conversation unfolded. His friend treated Lena with natural politeness and respect, responding to her calmly and attentively. Daniel realized how much the small adjustments had influenced the way others perceived her, and he felt proud not in a boastful way, but in a quiet, deep sense of satisfaction that Lena's dignity was visible to anyone who entered the home. Even the small routines around the apartment had shifted. Tasks that once felt purely functional now carried a sense of collaboration and mutual respect. Lena suggested better ways to organize the kitchen and manage laundry, and Daniel listened attentively. Her suggestions were thoughtful and practical, demonstrating her competence and insight. He realized that respect and autonomy could unlock potential in ways that commands and instructions never could. The apartment had become a space where both people contributed meaningfully. The energy was positive, cooperative, and uplifting. One evening, Daniel reflected on the journey they had taken together. He thought about the first day Lena arrived, the casual remark about the uniform and how little he had understood at the time. He remembered the subtle tensions, the careful movements, the polite smiles, masking awareness of assumptions. Now he could see the difference clearly. Lena moved with freedom, spoke with confidence, and carried herself with the dignity that had always belonged to her. Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude for her patience, her resilience, and her ability to teach him lessons without ever making him feel criticized. Lena, for her part, had also noticed the changes in Daniel. She saw how he had grown in understanding and awareness, how he had learned to pay attention to details, to recognize assumptions, and to act in ways that fostered respect. She appreciated his efforts, the thoughtfulness behind his decisions, and the consistency with which he treated her with dignity. Their relationship, though professional, had developed into one of mutual respect and quiet friendship. Each had influenced the other in meaningful ways, and the lessons they shared extended beyond the walls of the apartment. As the weeks continued, Daniel began to reflect on the broader implications of what he had learned. He realized that clothing, appearances, and societal expectations often shape the way people are treated in ways that are unfair and invisible. Yet he also understood that small, thoughtful actions, offering choice, listening carefully, acknowledging dignity, could counteract those pressures and create meaningful change. It was a lesson in empathy, awareness, and the quiet power of respect. One morning, Daniel and Lena were cleaning together when a neighbor stopped by to borrow something. Lena greeted him with her usual calm, confident manner. The neighbor, seeing her in her modest professional attire, interacted naturally, without assumptions, and thanked her politely when leaving. Daniel observed the interaction and smiled quietly to himself. He realized that the changes they had made were not about control or authority. They were about creating an environment where respect and dignity were the default, where people could exist as their true selves, without unnecessary pressure. Later that evening, Daniel and Lena sat together, reflecting on the journey they had shared. "I have learned so much from you," Daniel said softly. "You have taught me to see people differently, to listen, to observe, and to act with care. I realize now that respect is not automatic, it is something we create and nurture every day." Lena smiled, her expression warm. "And I have learned that trust and patience can change environments," she said. "You listened and acted. You made choices that mattered, and it made my work and life better. That is how small actions create real change." The months passed, and Daniel often thought back to Lena's first words, "It is made for human men." At the time, he had laughed, not realizing their meaning. Now he understood fully. Those words were about more than a uniform. They were about perception, assumptions, dignity, and the quiet lessons hidden in everyday life. They reminded him that appearances can influence behavior, but awareness, empathy, and thoughtful action can shape respect, confidence, and freedom. In the end, Daniel realized that the story of Lena and her uniform was not just about work or clothing. It was about learning to see people as they truly are. It was about creating spaces where dignity is protected, assumptions are challenged, and respect is automatic rather than conditional. It was about small acts of kindness, attentiveness, and understanding that together build a life where people can thrive. As he watched Lena move around the apartment one evening, arranging books and organizing the kitchen, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned more from her than she might ever realize. He had learned to notice, to listen, and to act with thoughtfulness. He had learned that respect and dignity are fragile but powerful, and that small choices can make a life-changing difference. Lena's presence had transformed not only the apartment but also his understanding of people and the world around him. And in that quiet reflection, Daniel understood why Lena had spoken the words she did on her first day. The uniform was not just clothing. It was a lens through which society judged her. But through awareness, care, and respect, he had learned to see Lena for who she truly was, not what the uniform implied. It was a lesson in humanity understanding, an empathy one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The story of Lena. And her uniform ended not with drama or conflict, but with understanding and growth. Daniel and Lena had created a space where dignity, choice, and respect mattered. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Sometimes, the smallest words and actions carry the greatest truths, and the quiet recognition of a person's worth can change not only their life, but the way we see the world.